It's just right. Thank you so much. Mahita, because we're doing the online thing, I guess I need to remain near the microphone and not wander around too much.
Maybe.
Yeah. That's okay.
Although, isn't there like the thing that moves that tracks voice? No. I think then you need to stay near the mic for the benefit of those online. Okay. So apparently there's a clip-on mic. Maybe we can use. Presume. Found it. Wonder if. Let me try that.
I can. I mean, does it automatically just work?
I might have to switch it on.
Something clever.
Let me switch it on. No, and then you can clip it to wherever it feels comfortable in your person. Yeah.
Oh, it's working.
Surprise.
Very much so.
There we go.
That's just like good.
Works. Can people online hear that nicely? How do we see what's happening on?
I don't know.
This is all quiet.
I'm operating from here.
So I know you're on presenting. I don't know how this thing works. How do I get back to Teams? Maybe I need press escape and go to Teams. Guys who are online, can you hear Kathryn nicely when she speaks?
Can you hear me? Is the microphone clear?
Maybe they're not there. Let's presume that they're. They'll let us know if there's a problem. Yes, Meg says yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Meg. Cool. That's, I think, all we wanted to be sure of. There we go.
There's for money.
Okay. Okay.
Okay,
Cool.
we've got a walking around microphone, which seems to be working. Okay.
Welcome to our colloquium class. My name is and I'll be chairing today while Dr. Kathryn Smith, as many people already know. So just a couple of words on the science communication colloquium. We just try to once a quarter or every now and then convene a presentation from someone who's working broadly in the field of science communication and doing leading edge either practice or theoretical work to just expand our minds in thinking about what science communication is and how we can advance both theory and research and practice in that field. So it's my delight to welcome Dr. Kathryn Smith, who is an interdisciplinary visual artist with specialization in forensic facial identification and depiction. She works on archival, forensic, humanitarian, and historical contexts. Her work is, truly original and truly fascinating, and really brings together a specific domain of scientific inquiry, forensic, with a specific domain of communicative inquiry, which is the artistic visual. So I think we're really in for a treat today to hear about her very original and exciting research. So she's both a researcher, she's doing both, and it's one of like two things. I'm about to list. She is a critical academic researcher and theorist, but she's also a practicing artist and curator, and a forensic worker. Yeah. So there are, you do things. You don't just make things for us to look at or write things to read, so do things. So yeah, we have a very, I think there's a very interesting transdisciplinary set of expertise and interests that so let me tell you more about her background. She's a member of the FTNU Contemporaries Award Legacy Panel. She also served as curator for that in 2003. 2004 was the recipient of the very prestigious Standard Bank Young Artist Award. Always want to watch those prizes, right? Has won several other honors and awards in her career as an artist. She's exhibited responsibly, doing commissioned work in some major exhibitions internationally. Also published widely on her topic of interest. So I'm going to read you all for them to take us a while. But I think important to note is that your doctoral thesis engaged a global network of international participants, extensive field work in South Africa, Korea, and the United States, to provide evidence or improvements in forensic post-mortem identification, raise your social-cultural lens. So you have that PhD from somewhere in the UK, it's not really here, that's not reason. Liverpool John Books, there it is, where she's still a visiting fellow. And here at Stellenbosch, she's chair of the Department of Visual Arts, where in just a couple of years ago, she established a lab called VisLab to support creative research in the interface of art, science, and technology. She's also a founding member of the Western Cape Cold Case Consortium. So these are just some of the main achievements. We're really excited to have you here. Look forward to hearing more about your research.
Thanks very much. So in person and online, always forget about recognizing online people. I'm going to try and because I can move around now, not be behind the days. I'm also going to put myself up now. How well I'm doing. It was so. Thank you, sir, for the invitation and for the introduction. I tend to start these presentations with apologies for those of you who've seen a lot of these this year. I need to start, but I tend to start with these two images because they bookend kind of where I started and where I am. So there are two images I took almost exactly 20 years apart. The first one is from post-mortem ledgers, which in most medical legal watch. I'm going to give a great big look. First images you've ever seen, and you will have to look through. And this was one example in Durban. And this family had obviously requested to retain the photograph from that book. And that is not a photograph would necessarily. The family member, but the only photograph. I can project a light into that absent space on the page, which seems to have stuck with me. And when long story short, but it's essentially what has driven the kind of research studies that informed my mid-career. There's something is informing what I'm doing now. The second image, I'll come back to this in a bit, but this is just in the Salt River Medical Legal Facility, and it's essentially the forensic officers benchmarking with each other. And I loved it because it was basically says there are more than one way to do it. And when this was during, I was looking into sort of operational issues and where the problems in the system might lie. And then that conversation is written on the board. So as a piece of visual communication, I thought it was pretty interesting. And a kind of anthropological artifacts. And what I'm trying to do today is focus on aspects of this work that I think are relevant to it. For me, if you were coming to a technical training workshop. So I've tried to keep it more in the kind of what I think is relevant to communication. So this is the night if I had a dollar slide. If I had a dollar for every time I was asked one of these questions. But it is quite interesting because these are listening. So these seems to be what exercises the popular imaginary when it comes to what forensic work is, because forensic for me is the F word. You say forensic and suddenly like the conversation can go in a number of different ways. And sometimes, but the idea of like, oh, it was so easy because you've got that hologram machine like punching on bones, whatever. But and then there's some other questions which get even posting the invitation asking me about, well, what do you have any? Essentially, just asking about methods, like this hopefully guide us in the right direction. And the last two are interesting because they point to different kind of ethical questions in respect of historical data. So the last question is, I have an old skull I inherited from a relative / quartered and / insert situation. And the second to last one is, can you make an age progression on my dead child or missing? So there's no right and wrong answer to those questions, but those interesting questions about one's ethical responsibilities in doing this work. And it's always a bit offensive. Essentially, forensic art is about producing faces with no visual reference. But you're doing it with the hope of having them identified. So you hope there is a relationship between accuracy and likeness. And my experience, people say these two items. Say that it's shape accurate doesn't mean that it's a recognizable face. So there's a plausibility. It's likeness aspect that's different. So when I teach this, not forensic imaging specifically, to my undergraduate students around politics of. And one of the things we do is, I have this, in this case, I was the person who had recognized me from all of this. Students are given creating the relationship between an eyewitness and forensic artist. We have to make today's learning from verbal description. So this is what a particular second year class. And I'm going to look pretty similar to our now. Some of them are really quite close. I think I would be recognized if you maybe not much, but I like thinking about the forensic imaginary because it occupies so much of our media life, I think. And so maybe scares our first launch on our screens, but I'm a child of the 70s and the 80s. So I'm internet and I had a different kind of thing, but for the first time I saw MacGyver reconstruct a face, I thought, wow. That is an episode called, I think, The Secret of the Park House. I remember so distinctly. I was probably about 12 or 13. And Colin Flaxman and Police File. Police File is largely, but I found that image of him. And then Walkie Park for a lot of people, where facial reconstruction was kind of written into a major novel. And then turned into a pretty fabulous film. Walkie Park is based on the work that you see in that fictional institution in the film and written about in the book. by the work of the Russian anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, who is considered the father of the anatomical method. So it's actually, there's a quite close connection to reality there. And then, of course, our more contemporary examples of the forensic imaginary. But what's happened in culture outside of art expression and scholarly world is we've started to see this idea of a forensic turn take root. So for me, the phrase forensic turn wasn't really in play yet, but this book was an exhibition catalogue by Ralph Rygoff, exhibition he curated in Los Angeles. And I think that was published in 98 or 99. But in that book, he introduces the term of forensic setting. And he's talking about it specifically with reference to certain conceptual or process-based contemporary art practices where an action takes place and what is left behind is essentially the artwork. So a viewer needs to kind of go through a pretty active process of kind of imagining or reconstructing the events that led up to essentially the residue. The idea of forensic aesthetics has taken on a slightly different emphasis in the work of Gail Weissman and their version has got a little bit more pictures, but it's an interesting thing that it's, for me, the first phrase was in Rygoff's curatorial exercise. Natural studies and unexpected doll houses that are still used to train detectives in Baltimore. Really incredible, made by a wealthy heiress called Frances Blaise Lee and mother of criminology in that state. She established the department of Harvard. And she built these doll houses in the 19. They're still in use. Visible Proofs was an extraordinary exhibition I didn't get a chance to see myself, but curated by Michael Sapol at the National Library of Medicine in the US. And then more recently, Welcome Collection Forensics Anatomy of Crime. The Crime Museum was at the Museum of London with, for the first time, the Black, what's known as the Black Museum, but it's essentially Scotland Yard, the East Museum. Objects and artifacts were put on display. And then Images of Conviction, Diane Dufour, incredible exhibition, which I called in London, originated in Paris, but that is a very wonderful deep dive into how the forensic and constructions of truth. So, and then a small selection from my bookshelves of what this looks like in terms of literature. So there is scholarship, and for me, a very useful and interesting thing is, I know there's a point here, but I can't find it now. That David Houston Jones, Visual Culture and Forensic, that's the most recent one. I'm very lucky to be written about in that. David is a very good colleague of mine. And hopefully we'll be doing something with a network, a forensic network. But all of this is to say that there is a lot of kind of humanities and social sciences focus on this, but that's not necessarily like, there's a bit of an asymmetry of forensic practice, which I think forensic is better as well. Just from a forensic facial imaging point of view, this is what the literature in our field kind of looks like. And I only did this to kind of, it's interesting to look at like periodization, like what happens when, what's driven at certain times. So 1962, the Human Skeleton in Forensic Medicine, that's remained in print and now till 2013, but then you really start seeing it pick up in 1970. And then all the way through it, you can start to see where computerization starts to kick in. And the question of how AI is impacting this field now is what forensic facial imaging is, other than those questions we started with, is essentially an evolution through methods and technologies. It's not facial recognition. So if you think about that, think about any bias, that kind of stuff, it's not that. It's part of forensic facial identification, but not in terms of what we do and in facial imaging. Some methods are strictly investigative intelligence, and some started to gain recognition power, largely because of how computers are. There's an interesting relationship to technology there, which I can say more about later. We could discuss that. Have been drawn to this, to forensic imaging, or forensic arts, as it's more commonly referred to, or historically certainly, because it has this very ability. So when I was writing my thesis, the sentence about art, which sounds entirely pretentious, because it's true, it has an local comparison, but also ontologically it's ambiguous as an art, because a lot of the stuff artists don't have, but scientists. But we've got a set of this kind of frieze of images, really is a visual capsule that we use. So craniofacial superposition, so you have a suspected identity for that skull and you can map shapes essentially. Like Rustin Case in the 1920s made this very famous. It was used and drives Weitzman and Keenan's theorization of the forensic aesthetic in the identification of Joseph Mengel's remains. And then we have the more kind of commonly understood forensic art, where you are either sculpturally creating a face from a skull. We've got an amazing piece by Frank Bender there, and then a more recent one by Caroline Wilkinson from Dundee. It's a Scottish case. So this would be manual sculpture, clay, wig, the whole thing. This one is done in the computer, and then it's essentially a big shot. So it is, we call this 2.5D, because it's object, virtual 3D object, but it's presented as a two-dimensional image. This is post-mortem depiction, which I'll talk more about, successfully identified South African case, post-mortem depiction, and now forensic genetics, facial phenotyping is kind of changing the game in some ways, but I have my reservations about that. Again, we'll talk about that later. So this was I just decided to share this as a breakdown of what I tried to do with my thesis, because it's hard, but theoretically as well as the practice and the service. So I had to do a number of things that were both theoretical and like quite social sciencey in some ways. So it was a very multimodal affair. But I was also realized that I brought a lot from my training and experience as an arts-based researcher. And this seemed to make quite a difference in how I was able to but somehow it worked. So I have summarized a lot of this in a series of slides, and I hope to not go on too much about this, but it had these, the study itself had these different moves. So the kind of main question that I was trying to ask, what is at stake in producing, working with, and to face for the purposes of forensic identification. Importantly, the person is deceased. Days of them extensively. They're not circulating in the post-mortem phase, but in order to understand that, because we have restrictions around where it's appropriate to circulate the images of the dead, then how we work the remaining has a different text. I need to look carefully at how we see post-mortem images circulate in our media. Database identities of like suspects and and then the second part of the question is to think of forensic art. So yes. And so I did all these things, which we won't talk about too much, but I was interested in kind of three things in the middle are what are your critical orientations? Well, I was asking myself this, but of the field as well. The idea of from public administration, and I think there's a slide on that. But I was really interested in how images, forensic images, do and social remediation. So the concept of remediation comes up quite a lot. But really it's about finding what are some ground truths. A very technical theory of what it is to do this work and really look at your work that we know that these images work in the sense that they can be functional, but they also have other kinds of work to do. Social they do when we're thinking about the technical operational work that they need to do. And then I took a lot of my research, all the interviews I was doing with different people, and made artwork and cinema. It was not required or even examined. I don't think it was part of the piece, but I made it and then. So it's a way it's a website, speak like that's from online and there is images from all around the world agreed to participate, even though some of them were paid and so no one is like, and I use my own voice these stories. This is very it's about I speak about in the conceptual theorization of the work. And communication people. What is interesting is how this work is organized scientifically. And a very important report was published in 2009 forensic science in the United States. And a lot of scientific disciplines didn't come out very well. In that methods didn't. So this very wonderful piece by Manukin et al. About needing a research culture in forensic science. It's interesting because a lot of forensic science are the opposite. A lot of them move information between research and practice. And then this rainbow wheel is the organization of scientific area committees. So all disciplines of forensic science are now organized under these kind of committees with subcommittees that are little spokes coming out from the wheel. And the circle at the top, sorry, it's not very clear color-wise, but the circle at the top is the facial identification subcommittee. So that was all. And they're organized under digital and multimedia. Forensic art or facial imaging doesn't have the secret that's very complicated. It touches 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all of the blue subcommittees except for 2, under crime scene and death investigation. And I would argue now it reaches across to biology and DNA with forensic genetics. So it's interesting that we don't have a committee that organizes the practice, and that's both challenge is so accessibility before the big how the committees are. Invisibility body. So this goes back to the questions of how images would then circulate with that. And I've just taken 3 examples here. This image of journalists around the body of Muhammad Gaddafi, obviously treated as a trophy in this image, but of smartphones and cameras that are in this image means that there are multiple versions of this image captured and distributed. So the idea of the body and our digital distribution of itself is an interesting image of violence. And then affective power of looking at images of torture. And so this reaction image of someone looking at the images released by the informant Nala Cesar about torture in Syria. This was on exhibition at the United Nations, so people argue should these images be exhibited under what conditions. And then this was fascinating for me because as much as people argue about exposed to images for dead, that somehow it's not appropriate. When Nelson Mandela died, this putative image of his proposed mortal portrait was leaked, so that it looked like that. And then when I found another version of the image sort of circulated, they kind of over it on Twitter. And it turned out to be a hoax because it was this image of him. And it was interesting to me that when someone occupies iconic status, it's almost like necessary to kind of produce the what's the image to put it up there or something. It's a little bit like we would see the image. I don't know. You know, there's so many ways to read that in the sense of perspective, etc. So, and then these images really struck me, and a lot of the stuff I include because it was kind of happening. Well, I was very much alive to what was happening at the time of doing the research. So bringing, and what was very current when I started doing the formal part of the research was crisis of so forth. And arguably this image of Alan Kurdi on the beach is what galvanized the European community to really start paying attention to this, as much as it had already started in the mid-90s with the first boats reaching the Canary Islands. And then more recently, this image points to another sort of what I call mirror sites, that these are kind of hotspots of migration, which also means hotspots of complex identification. Colleagues there in biological anthropology will know this is the stuff that really exercises us, because it means we need to do things differently. These situations are complicated and they don't conform to like normal method. So, and in these images were particularly galvanizing, I think, because they include the bodies of children. And the minute you show childhood in one image, it tends to upset people, as it should. From my contemporary art point of view, I'm interested in how some of the ideas around forensic facialities, the idea of the face of the technology, starting to feature for years now in the work of contemporary artists. And these were some that were kind of works that was published at the time, or around the time of doing the research. Zach Blass, a very interesting artist who's working a lot with kind of facial recognition technologies and bias. Adam Grunberg and Oliver Channerin managed to craft a very secretive Russian 3D CCTV system that essentially makes a 3D model of the face that you can through a room, and applied these to, and used some very interesting characters to take their portraits, including and then absolute favorites, hands down, who's an agent, but this particular work where she, while Chelsea Manning was in prison, she managed to squirrel out some DNA samples and then produced this work in collaboration. The exhibition was called A Becoming Resemblance. That's Chelsea Manning looking at the different versions of Chelsea Manning produced through. So the idea of what our face represents, especially if someone and sex and all that stuff, is really just a fantastic piece of work. Why we do this is because recognizing the post-mortem face, it's very difficult. Some of you know. I use it as an example because it's just a very powerful example. We know from disaster victim situations that there's about a 50% rate of misidentification looking either at the body itself or a photograph of the person. And there are different reasons for why it's difficult to recognize someone as deceased. But that is Marilyn Monroe, who's very well known face, but not in that state. So I think it kind of makes the point of both changes to the face, make someone unrecognizable, but the emotional labor attached to doing that identification could cause families to either do the identification or reject the identification. And ultimately creating problems for two families if you or in a misidentification. In South Africa, we have about 8,000 cases of unnatural death are admitted to our two main medical legal facilities, Tigerberg, which is attached to our institute, here the biggest, full service facilities in Cape Metropolis, kind of split between those two services. Approximately 9 to 10%, and this is now also a national statistic, although it's not formally kept, remain unidentified. So we have north of 6,000 people a year nationally are unknown. And I did a records review of 1,010 unclaimed cases over an 8.5-year period, and 71% of them were admitted in a state where we could have done on admission. But assuming there's no identification happens, it's change, the body changes regardless of refrigeration. And of those 71 cases could have benefited from this, it was only possible. So, which showed us that there was error introduced on admission because of poor photography, purely on the basis of poor photography. And if we had a decent photograph, standardized photograph of these individuals, the possibility of doing a very simple process to produce a public appeals process would have been possible. Instead, we end up having to clean skeletal or decomposed remains and do a full facial reconstruction, and you're losing a lot of data there because with someone who's clothing, you've got hair, you've got skin tone, texture, all of those things you can't know from the skull alone. What we also know in our context is that we are legally allowed to pauper, so release to the state, unidentified individuals after 30 days. 30 days is nowhere near enough time to do what needs to be done. And the fact that people are moving around. So we've got, the colleagues there are tracing families back to the Eastern Cape, etc. There's lots going on. But because they want to do a good job and they legally can't release people, well, they certainly can't, shouldn't be releasing people without education. They need to an identity. They need to prove that before they can be. So their best efforts are really represented by those quite extraordinary numbers, where although they're allowed to release after 30 days, 687 days was in the sample alone. They kept that individual and tried for 687. That's pretty heroic. What that means is that there's storage problems. identified people needing to be cared. So that image on the side is a kind of proof of concept public appeals poster that I developed. I took a sample of 20, I tracked them through the system to look at this minimum and maximum days. And then of those, I produced post-mortem predictions for 10 of them. And I think about 50% of those could conceivably. Of that sample of 10, 5 of them remained unidentified after the. So why should we care? We have a silent mass disaster. Unidentified. To go to this, we have about what's the stat, Mandy? 1 pathologist per million people. Just in South Africa. It's insane. It's a scarce skills thing. So my PhD students and our colleague Pearl are now the only 2 sort of formally trained civilian forensic imaging specialists. There's 2 in the police. Legal identification is a social justice issue and a criminal justice issue. Works in both ways. I speak about reconstructing personhood. It's not perfect, but it's reuniting a person and it can legally do things for families who are trying to wrap up estates, etc. We don't have a single database to compare data between missing people and unidentified people in this country. Trick. So I don't know, it's my kind of dying wish. That is the real thing before I leave this planet. And I will try my best to move that process forward. We require novel means of identification in this context. Because of the complex nature of it, we are looking to, and the forensic humanitarian action evidence is now being published that we need to think about secondary identifiers in our context. Well, the science world talks about primary identifiers, which are examples. We don't necessarily have those in our country, which so we need the secondary identifiers, which is clothing and imaging, essentially. And I think we could lead. We have by sheer volume of cases alone, we could lead on this internationally with a kind of focus and attention. And my thinking is really kind of pivots around at the ASFM recently in Kigali. There was lots of African solutions. I'm looking at what are the most cost-effective solutions with the greatest impact. So making changes to the forms that SAPS used to. We started the W4C with this idea of doing multifactorial analysis and like experimental science. And we did that, but we realized that the most impactful thing to do was to change the form that they used to gather the information that someone would change the graphical depiction of the body that they used to mark up, because I'll show you a picture. The body looked very racialized, very, and did not represent the kind of body that would represent one type of body versus the numerous bodies that we would around us. So I did lots of field work, and I won't go into this in too much detail. I was looking at there were sort of formal participants and interlocutors. So there were 2 types of people I was interviewing, and some of them are kind of allied to the field, and some of them are specifically imaging specialists, law enforcement, and civilians. So there was a whole range of contexts that I needed to kind of talk to. And one of the, after being at a forensic meeting in Texas, hosted by the Texas Department of Public Safety, also known as, I was suddenly alive to the fact that there seems to be a difference in sensibility, I guess, between who. And that was kind of like I was thinking when it felt more gendered and between the facial identification composite, like suspect related stuff. So in part of my interviews, I asked people to respond to this motivation scale. So like what do. And so on the one side of the scale, I had get the bad guys. And on the other side of the scale, advocacy. And the spread was really interesting, where the vast majority of people were victim advocacy. They also happened to mainly be women. And on the other side of the scale was mainly the men and also mainly women. So it was an interesting picture. And then also decided to speak to forensic officers as kind of key knowledge holders, because they're very seldom asked for their opinion. And they really are at the coalface. So I did a focus group. There's some of them in the River facility scoring forensic depiction images about how they felt about these images. They are invaluably situated, these forensic officers, because they are essentially, they meet members of the public, police officers, pathologists, etc. They're at the scene doing body recovery. They're incredible. They assisted postmortems, skills. And then these were 4 key takeaways from this was honest must make the unidentified dead look like criminals. They're very alive. Black and white images also kind of fed into that. I do them in black and white, but enable multiple angles for visual identification. Internal politics obstructs the implementation of improvements. This is like a structural, like within their organization. And then they really want to register of unknowns in organizations. Centralized is a good takeaway. Mentioned speaking likeness. Sort of finish off now. I won't talk to this in too much detail. We can maybe keep looking at questions. But essentially, this map tracks what I was doing in the kind of very social sciences mode of the semi-structured, how that kind of fed into these, reorganized this information into a series of narrative themes that you can go through. That's how you navigate the website and through this story. But this is just a point about remediation. So visually, this is an example of an image where it's a less experienced forensic artist, someone who can draw, but who hasn't kind of picked up on photographic distortion, etc., in the source image that they've been working from. This circulated for about a year with no public. This was redone by a very experienced colleague and then included the tattoos and other personal effects, so secondary identifiers I was talking about. And this was almost immediately recognized and then confirmed with familial DNA. So I speak about this idea of visual remediation becoming quite a central kind of theory within this of how it works, impacting textual interpretability. So it becomes a very important tool for communicating the science behind it. Certainly worked like this in the Sutherland project and in the W4C project, using the visual to kind of communicate the scientific data. But this remediation is also about speaking of from one form of media to another, but also maintaining the connotations of repair and improvement, which is essentially what's actually happening physically when one makes these images. So this is VizLab. We've got this haptic virtual sculpture system. So we can do it. We have an entirely digital workflow that also enables touch information from touch from the skeletal remains, which is essential because not all of the information we need in the craniofacial analysis process is visually available as well. And we have some associated researchers, supervising students with us over there, one done, one ongoing, and then Pearl, who you can see in the image. This was a workshop we did with undertakers and undertakers how to take prints and post-mortem photographs, because we look not only the the unidentified deceased don't only enter this forensic system, they also are so-called natural deaths, and then they enter a different system in the city of Cape Town, where because they are criminal or other unnatural framing of that individual, they don't enjoy any support from SAPS or to assist with that education. So it's I had no idea about that post-mortem population. It was just we became alive to this situation. So the idea of a pracademic essentially takes practitioner and academic and smushes them together, and public administrators came out of that world, anyone who's doing policy. So it seems to me a pretty useful, it's something that I absolutely identify with when I read the definition, thought I'm doing this in my head. But it also seems to be a very interesting concept in respect of the idea of transdisciplinarity and sort of research for impact, the extent to which those of us who do practice and then academic scholarly research sort of at the same time. I included this for two reasons. Successful case from Sweden that I worked on when I was in Face Lab. So this was a wonderful moment where the proof of concept actually worked. And this individual, one of the things we often don't know, because not enough research is done, and it's very, very hard to do the research, is to what extent does the actual image assist in the identification? I don't think this process is happening at the same time. In this case, we know that the reconstruction was identified by his family, and they confirmed his identity with DNA. In Sweden, it was skeletonized in the field. It takes a long time to, this was actually a very quick process in terms of the reconstruction being commissioned to his identification. And they can now investigate his murder, because you can't investigate a perpetrator until you know the identity of the victim. But I did love very much, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it in Norwegian because I don't have an idea, but the way that how they refer to the facial reconstruction, the literal translation is computer animated phantom drawing, which I thought was lovely because it is kind of all of those things. I'm really interested, and I'm moving towards a closure here. I'm really interested in how we can engage. These are some of the most. If the law enforcement community and investigative authorities are very nervous about what social media can do to an investigation, it can point to the. However, it's my colleague Joe Mullins over there, and he has really done extraordinary things in a very managed and careful way. So working with students at the New York Academy of Art, University of South Florida, and in all of these workshops, which I'm really regardless, we can get people who want to learn anatomical facial reconstruction, who have a basic skill set. Mind. All of the cases that he introduces into these workshop scenarios are actual unidentified people. And so once they are then photographed and publicized, this, I mean, to the extent that he even took it to Comic-Con, and they used an unresolved case from San Diego. Comic-Con happened. So it makes sense to do that. And then operation identification is really being very effective. Those are reconstructions and then identified people comparisons of people who die and their attempts to cross the border into the United States from Mexico. And what's really instructive about that initiative is the recognition that sometimes engaging with the authorities is counterproductive. So engaging with charities on the other side of the border who are looking after the interest, that's where it becomes more effective to do that communication. Phases from DNA, I'll just go through this really quickly. That's here. 2012, he was playing with this idea of can you make a face from a DNA sample? Simultaneously, they were looking at doing this scientifically, and now it has been visualized by a company, Paragon. And then it does this thing where it's like the ancestry estimation. So a lot of what I looked at in my piece, well, intersection of face, race, and identification. And in our context, that is a particularly controversial area. I think scientifically, I mean, this is a very broad statement, so, but I think it's controversial. Full stop. I also don't think it's particularly useful because it doesn't necessarily tell you what someone looks like. So there's the need to sort of separate this concept of ancestry from your physical appearance. It's more useful to me. And also, what I worry about with this is the authority that is given to DNA as a gold standard of identification. And if you see this image and it's like been made with DNA, it's not entire. There's a kind of a claim to the image, the power of the image. And I know that that claim is not very. But going back to the forensic imaginary from the beginning of the talk, us to these ideas and these claims. So this is something that I don't know. And there's probably too much else to talk about, but I'll just end with this one. But on this point of DNA and the piece called Probably Chelsea that we looked at earlier, this is a group that is very close to my heart, and I volunteer with them. The Transload Task Force. They are an online, self-organized group of people, and they look at the issue of gender variance and how the systems that we report bodies into, living or dead, are super binary. And if you are a non-binary person or a trans person, you don't fit into any of the categories. So what happens is because in the United States, there are a lot of public access databases, you can scour this. Look like this question. Yeah. So I'm just showing you that this is entirely experimental. And Anthony Redgrave, we were interested in an individual connected to a certain unresolved and this missing person who is near Santiago. One of the issues that Mia embodies is that surviving families might not recognize their child's gender identity. They might report a missing person either by their biological sex and or their DNA. It's not helpful because it's not helpful. And this was the case with Mia. So there was this, and this kind of came together from a number of cases, but I was interested in this Long Island serial killer case because I knew of one of the sex remains that was anthropologically, so scientifically, reported as being a so-called Asian male, unquote, from Europe. All of the other contextual stuff around the mythology of the Long Island. Sex workers identified on the places. The 2D of this individual and was that they released this image as male consent. It has never something about the context of Mia Santiago's disappearance that we thought, wow, what if the so-called biological it's interesting term, also different terminology. And I just thought, well, we know that I know features of Indigenous people from South Africa might have features that look like those of people from countries we would identify as Asian. So what does this mean? So we thought we would just test something out. So we took, this was the only frontal facing image that we could find. We did a face close correction software that allows you to, so as I said, super anecdotal, non-scientific, but just the next thought experiment. I then took the facial reconstruction that was released of the unknown Long Island person and then did a superposition with the thought that if it's possible that their features should line up in the space. You know, our cells have holes where our features go. Like you can't put the eyes in the wrong place. In doing that, the features match up. So I'm not saying it's necessarily the same person, but if you just change the to what extent this depiction of action was driven by the artist, because me, that's an extremely good in terms of physical appearance. If I was an investigator, I would now, because we know the family of this person and we have the skeleton of this other case, just exclude on the basis of a DNA test or actually find that maybe that's the same person. So I'd be interested in really does another one. We don't have enough time to talk about this now. It's well documented on the Transdo website, but this is a very interesting example for me of like the sensitivity of the representation. And that one on the right, I'm really stunned by, because that redo was done with the full knowledge that this person was a transgender woman moving around the world. Like, the remains were actually thought to be a biological woman for various features found on the bone, and then it was realized that actually those features could also be the result of technology. So an amateur forensic artist who has been extremely successful. So his amateur status says nothing about his efficacy, really. He's this much more sensitive image. He does this kind of contextual stuff in the background that places the unknown person in the last known location. So in this case, the isotopes trace it to Florida. So we've got Florida in the background. And then in terms of the affordances of AI, people have used the internet to play around. So that image, the Transdo task force put it through Face App so that it would either make Face App again red, so it was doing the same thing. This is a more interesting, a more recent example of, and we're experimenting with this now in FirstLab, is the extent to which you can add texture onto a sculpture using ArtBreeder. This is just the one that we're using now. It's not great because it does something. It does something to the image processing that changes the featural shape, which is not useful for us. But I can see big radical efficiencies coming down the line with this. It would be amazing if I could be made that and the computer to me, because we would get through more stuff. This is an ongoing project, really taking the kind of principles and interdisciplinary work we were doing with Sutherland into the forensic case. It's ongoing, so I can't report too much on this, but the experimental methods we're using here, which wouldn't necessarily be accepted in. Very interesting. Taking it into community-based workshops with forensic officers and undertakers. And at the bottom there, if you can see those are some of the graphical interventions we proposed to the police to make their body segmentation diagrams more racially, gender-wise, and age neutral. Not always reporting on someone who looks like science strategy in 1985. Sutherland, again, big team, again, interdisciplinary stuff, I suppose, is the point that I'm making here. That's the final gallery of Sutherland's ancestral faces. This should be coming out on Thursday. In class one, finally, a big article about this whole process is going to be published. And that's all. Listening.
Amazing how much you're doing just in general.
Kind of all the same thing, right?
So we have of course some time for comments, questions, contributions. And I'm really struck by how much of your work is actually about communicating and about connecting the right information with the right people.
Yeah, the art thing and the science thing, I think that methodologically those things are necessary, but it is. And the speaking likeness, one of the sort of things that drove that was really trying to foreground the idea of conversation. Was when we did the W4C workshops, I'll just go back to that slide for a second because you can see the nice smiling faces of Billy over there. This was really important because in the thesis, and for the first time, I was able to answer a question that people have been asking me. How can you be interested in these two seemingly complete, like, I don't know, different. The concept of forensic care, like, really made me think about that. And I realized that I treat this work the same way as I do I'm curating a show with museums, like to care for things, bodies, objects, whatever they might be. In order to do that care properly, you have to care for the systems that they pass through. So whether that's the forensic pathology services and SAPs and that relationship, or we're thinking about objects in museums that need to be, that need to undergo a process of repatriation, etc. Same kind of thing. Like it's the same kind of idea. But I was really encouraged by these workshops that we did and I introduced the idea of forensic humanitarian action to this group of forensic officers. They understood what it was. They saw this like reframing their work in humanitarian terms as a way to drive policy change. Now, I haven't been able to do anything, but I did get. This is like a concept. They saw themselves like represented way in those terms. And the numbers that we are facing in this country meet the threshold, shall we say, of a disaster, like disaster response. But because it's a slow evolution over time, it's a single event. I mean, there's lots of other things to say about why the Mediterranean moment does. It is a hell of a lot in this world from a whole host of different disciplinary perspectives. It does come back to community and to different stakeholders and audiences. This is the first time the forensic pathology service in this country was formed as a result of the forensic services were built under these. And due to the findings of the commission, they separated them out, and forensic services now resort to the Department of Health. They compete for resources for delivering. So the data are not in that way, understandably. But this was and that service was formed in 2006. There's two different provinces around the same table and had a conversation.
question.
So I don't know why.
Any other questions or thoughts that anyone wants to share?
I'm not giving any eye on.
Let me do that. Let's see if anyone online has a note, but any questions about how this might relate to, I don't know, a journalistic practice or?
There is a big event happening in the next few weeks. So they're having a week before that. They're having a session specifically for the media on on understanding the science.
That's cool.
So
That'd be great for us.
they'll have me today about that. So I have that information from the ICRC people. I can share it with you and maybe it can go out
That would be
on your
amazing.
networks if you're interested. Because the event itself is very contained. It's a 2-day thing at the President Hotel. Oh, you going?
Yes, I'm going, but only one day I can. I'm trying to see what would be.
Okay. I don't know if they'll accept you yet, but they'll be. Yes,
There is a question online. This is from Lucrezia. Thank you for the presentation. Amazing work. Microphone doesn't work. Not a problem, Lucrezia. We'll read it for you. It was mentioned the problem of identifying people who are crossing borders from Africa as well. Wondering if there's a plan for VisLab to work or collaborate with the organizations working for their identification, and eventually what that collaboration might look like. So I think that's interesting in terms of thinking about one of the cases you showed us was a migrant from Poland who somehow
Yes.
got lost and passed away in Sweden. And we
Yes.
obviously also have a lot of migrants from across the continent coming into South Africa.
Yes.
Any thoughts in response?
So many thoughts. I will say that the ICRC, International Commission for the Red Cross, is doing incredible work in the space. So they have a tracing program, so they're working with families of missing persons. They supported us in the Western Cape Consortium initiative. That initiative is really, it's located in the Western Cape. We're hoping to kind of scale nationally, but it's very early days. And then 2 places where migrants, which is a word that I don't like, people gravitate towards centres of economic opportunity in the South African context. And Gauteng and the Western Cape are those 2 of those provinces. They're also the provinces with capacity in forensic anthropology, in the sense that both provinces have 2 universities that train and do casework supporting SAPS, FPS, etc. So the ICRC supported the workshops that we did and that I spoke about, the W4C workshops, and there's only space to grow. So there's work we're doing with European colleagues as well, with my affiliation to FaceLab. So it's very much a watch this space moment, but the conversations are very much happening. DNA. Oh yes, DNA for Africa. So again, the conference that I just mentioned is that intersection of ICRC and DNA for Africa. It's a very promising partnership. And DNA for Africa is an extraordinary organization. They essentially brought us the DNA bill in this country. And if the conference in Kigali was anything to go by, what is happening in some of our neighboring African countries in terms of forensic capacity is extremely encouraging. But we need that Pan-African network if we're going to do, and that network needs to reach Europe, and it needs to go north and it needs to go south at the same time, because they seem to be the patterns of migration.
Okay, so I have a question. There's one more question online, and then after that we can probably go eat cake and drink tea. So my question is, what do you think is lacking in terms of like public conversations about this work? Like, are journalists writing about it or not? If they are, like, are they getting it right? Are they framing it correctly? If they're not, how can the scientists or the artists working in the space like get them to care about the story? You know, so I'm thinking more about the kind of the media coverage of this.
And then there's a question from Megan online. She says she notices the importance of working beyond disciplines and outside of institutions to kind of really actually communicate effectively and broadly. What potential do you think this offers artists specifically? What potential do artists specifically offer for such transdisciplinary work?
Your question, what can journalists do? There have been some very, very wonderful and important journalists. Sarah Wild, will name her. She did a series of articles a couple of years ago that really brought attention to this problem in the South African context. Experience, and we have a journalist in the room. My experience of this is often that, in how I'll use an example. I was recently asked, and there's a profile being written about me, and in terms of visuals to accompany this profile, suggestions were made of like how I should perform myself, and they're like, what's the sort of stage of crime scene thing or whatever, and it's like. So when I like that would not be my reality. So my concern is it goes back to the idea of the forensic imaginary. Like we need to calm down on the CSI fantasy and kind of really focus on the reality. My sense is that there are people within the authorities that would really have very interesting stories to tell, but those stories are often unable to get out. And when I was doing my research, and this kind of answers Megan's question, I think it was as well, what can artists offer? There was that, I mean, I don't know if but there was that poster that ostensibly was released by the CIA in the 1950s or 1980s, because they mixed all levels of society, something. And I think it's true of journalists too. Whether, like, to what extent are journalists trusted or not trusted? And I think there's a similar artists operating in science spaces. That was certainly my experience until I got a lab coat. Suddenly my authority changed. I had this kind of, I call it the cloak of invisibility. Like I'm suddenly now a scientist. But I think artists, specifically in the ways in which we do our research, we have maybe that kind of unbounded, we don't really have the rules, and we're expected to be renegade in some way. We're expected to kind of go against the grain. There are real affordances there, assuming you have the requisite trust. People need to trust you to like tell them stuff and let you in the room and all that. And the academic concept is that the trust is embodied in that figure. So it may be a question of communication again. It's like, how do you frame yourself? I have found that it is to my disadvantage sometimes to talk about forensic art. It's more useful and I think more accurate to talk about forensic facial imaging, especially now that we're benefiting so much from medical imaging. Simply artistic skills anymore, but there's certainly a need for artistic skills to do optimal visual communication. You can get basics right without like experienced artistic skills, but the artistic skills it does really help.
And it's possibly also for like the emotional connection. It's like a missing person, a deceased person who is unidentified. There are there's narratively a lot of, journalistically, a lot of questions and stories there, but ultimately it's about the respect and dignity for that human being, and knowing that they have people who love them, who want to know what happened to them. And I think that artistic talent and skill is needed to like capture that something of like that person and the emotional connection.
Yeah. So I'm not mindful of that. It's like of the remediation and what affect. So accessing that kind of affective potential of the image is a certain empathy which a computer automated system is not going to give you. When you're working with traumatized victims of, if you're doing that kind of forensic art, and an image of their aggressor, you need exchange. That it's just, and then the software that's used often, mediates not optimally the result. But people often say, like, we try very hard to like not introduce emotion into the images because we can't possibly know what someone's personality is like. So how they smile, With the Swedish case, I showed an open mouth because he had extreme identify, but otherwise we try and do neutral. But even when you do that, people find ways to connect with the images emotionally. And the Sutherland faces were a classic example of that, where the descendant families were finding, it looks like that one looks like me. And, they were finding rapport.
They were being human.
And they were, it was a very emotional moment.
Yeah.
And it was quite disturbing in the sense that I think they expected images that, what one of the descendant family members, people I would meet in the street, but they would look somehow more abstract or, I don't know. Stylized, or that the connection was extremely immediate. And then they describe the images, which again is a communication, nice communication, as being the way into the bigger story. So I don't understand the level of detail with a lot of the scientific analyses that is done. I have an understanding, sufficient understanding to like use it in the depiction, but knowing that the images can just let you in a way is, I think, the best we can ask for.
Yeah. So on that note, I think our time is up. So thank you to everyone who came and participated, and thank you for sharing so much about your fascinating work. We have tea and cake, so please do stay and enjoy some visitors who are here in person. And everyone else will hopefully see you at our next colloquium. We'll announce it.
Look and say, everyone online, thank you for coming. Didn't realize standing over there.
Yeah, but I was standing here trying to look friendly and watching you with great interest.